The situation in Ukraine has not become any less fraught over the last week. Nato has warned Russia further intervention in Ukraine would be a historic mistake with grave consequences. The warning came as Moscow masses troops on the Ukrainian border and Kiev moves to reassert control over pro-Russian protesters across eastern Ukraine. University of Otago Professor of International Relations Robert Patman joins us with his thoughts on the issue. Good evening.
Good evening, Rebecca.
What is the situation as at today?
I think it's potentially explosive. There's about three factors which make this a very tense situation. First of all, Russia recently increased the price of gas, the export of gas to Ukraine. Ukraine is critically dependent on this product, and they've raised it by 83%, which, according to the Ukrainian leadership, is a form of economic warfare. Russian troops have mobilised along the Ukrainian border for a number of weeks, but more disturbingly, there is a number of pro-Russian activists who have seized control of government, regional government-controlled buildings, and they've taken control of 3 buildings. The authorities in Ukraine have got control back of 1, but that leaves the other 2 in pro-Russian hands. And I think the other point you alluded to is the warning that the Nato leadership has just given Mr. Putin, that he would risk making a historic mistake, and by that they mean that Russia risks international isolation if it tries to take advantage of the unrest that's developing in eastern Ukraine. And many people believe, including the US Secretary of State, that the Russians are deliberately fomenting unrest in the eastern Ukraine as a prelude to an invasion of the eastern part of the country.
Would Moscow be working at that level?
Well, it showed with the annexation of Crimea that it doesn't accept the territorial status quo of an independent Ukraine. And I think Mr. Putin certainly is prepared to try his luck. I don't think necessarily wants to invade the country, but he simply wants to have more influence than he currently has with an independent Ukraine. The Russian leadership are fully aware that the majority of people in Ukraine actually want to be aligned with the EU.
Will the US allow itself to be dragged into this conflict?
I think the American leadership have spoken in terms of costs and sanctions for the Russian leadership, and again they've warned them in the last 24 hours of more costs. They haven't spoken about a military response, but America is a key part of NATO, and NATO has amongst its ranks a number of countries such as Poland and the Baltic states, which are particularly sensitive to Russian pressure on the Ukraine. And so America may find itself involved, albeit inadvertently, in any showdown that develops. I don't think it's realistic to believe that America will be left out of this equation.
How important do you think taking control of Ukraine is to Putin?
I think Mr. Putin believes it's critical. This is part of Russia's attempt to reassert itself as a great power. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite got the economy to match those geopolitical ambitions. And Mr. Putin runs the risk of gravely miscalculating. He wants to it seems to me that he clearly wants to dominate the eastern part of the Ukraine. He wants part of the Ukraine to be part of his wider Euro-Asian project led by Russia. He has a distinct interest in preventing an independent Ukraine joining the EU.
And there've been brawls in the Ukrainian parliament. Is that leadership stable?
At the moment, Ukraine has an interim leadership, and of course there are all these tensions going on within the country, not least in the east. And I think there's serious debates and tensions about what to do. But I think the Ukraine leadership, the interim leadership, is pledged to hold elections in May. It's also pledged to restructure Ukraine on a federal basis to give the various regional parts more influence. If they carry out those measures, that could undercut the position of Mr. Putin and prevent him from getting a lever to control events in the eastern part of the Ukraine. But there's no doubt about it. This is a very, shaky transition since the fall of the Yanukovych government in February, which was a pro-Russian government. And of course, since then, the Russians have been distinctly unhappy about. They have not recognised the transition government, and that, of course, is a source of instability, I should say, because if the biggest neighbour of the Ukraine doesn't recognise the transitional government, that in turn ferments problems within the region, within Ukraine.
What's likely to happen in the next few days? Very
Very difficult to tell. We do know that there's talks planned between the EU, Russia, the United States and the Ukraine. They look like crisis talks which are planned for next week. But the situation on the ground Mr. Putin has warned that if the Ukrainian government takes measures against the pro-Russian activists on the ground, that they reserve the right to take measures. And the parliamentary authorization which allowed Russia to effectively annex Crimea was the authorization bill which enabled Mr. Putin to take military action in Ukraine was not limited to the Crimea. It just said the Ukraine. So he may feel he's got the authorization to move into the Ukraine.
Professor of International Relations, Robert Patman, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.